The law was called the Rethan Accord, and it had been in force for 67 years before anyone needed to question it. The accord was not drafted in haste. It was not born from a single incident. It was the product of 3 years of negotiation among the founding species of the Galactic Concord, and it addressed, in precise institutional language, a concern that had been growing since humanity's admission to galactic society: that the human approach to warfare was incompatible with the command structures of a multi-species military alliance. The accord prohibited human officers from holding fleet command positions above the rank of task group leader, which in Concord military hierarchy meant they could command individual squadrons of up to 12 vessels, but could not command formations, fleets, or combined operations involving ships from multiple species. The accord did not prohibit human participation in the Concord's combined fleet. It did not restrict human service in combat roles, tactical advisory positions, engineering assignments, or logistical operations. It restricted one thing: the authority to command large-scale fleet actions. The justification, as stated in the Accord's preamble, was doctrinal incompatibility. The Concord's combined fleet operated under a unified command doctrine that had been developed over 4 centuries by its founding species: the Tayari, the Rithori, and the Velesi. The doctrine emphasized predictability, procedural adherence, and graduated force application. Fleet engagements were planned through computational modeling. Decisions were made through structured consensus among command staff. Escalation followed prescribed stages. Withdrawal was governed by threshold calculations that balanced losses against objectives. The doctrine worked. In 4 centuries of combined operations, it had produced a military force that was methodical, reliable, and effective against every threat the Concord had faced. Human command philosophy did not fit this model. The Concord's Military Affairs Committee, in the assessment that preceded the Accord's drafting, identified several characteristics of human command practice that it classified as doctrinally divergent. Human commanders demonstrated a persistent tendency to deviate from pre-established plans based on real-time judgment. They made decisions faster than the Concord's consensus-based command process could accommodate. They employed deception, feinting, and misdirection as standard tactical tools, practices that the Concord's doctrine explicitly discouraged because they introduced uncertainty into the command environment. They accepted higher levels of risk than Concord operational guidelines permitted. They delegated authority to subordinates more freely than Concord hierarchy allowed, and they demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice portions of their force to achieve broader objectives, a practice the Concord's doctrine classified as unnecessary attrition. The assessment was thorough, professional, and not inaccurate. Human commanders did all of those things. What the assessment did not address, because the question was not asked, was whether those characteristics were weaknesses or strengths. The committee assumed the former, because the characteristics deviated from a doctrine that had worked for 4 centuries. The Rethan Accord was drafted accordingly. I should introduce myself properly, because my perspective on what follows is shaped by who I am and what I was doing when the Accord was tested. My name is Captain Eleanor Vasquez. I served in the Concord's combined fleet for 22 years, the last 11 of them as a task group leader, commanding a squadron of 8 vessels assigned to the 3rd Sector Group. I was, at the time the events I'm about to describe began, 49 years old, the holder of 3 combat commendations, and the most senior human officer in the combined fleet who was not a staff advisor or a tactical consultant. I was as high as the Rethan Accord permitted a human to go. The glass ceiling was not metaphorical. It was written into galactic law. I did not resent the Accord. I want to be clear about that because the narrative that has developed since, the story of the oppressed human officers chafing under alien restrictions, is simpler than the truth. I understood why the Accord existed. I had served under Concord doctrine for over 2 decades. I had seen it work. I had seen the computational models produce engagement plans that were elegant, efficient, and effective. I had seen the consensus-based command process arrive at decisions that balanced risk across multiple species forces with a fairness that unilateral human command would struggle to match. The doctrine had merits. The Accord was built on a legitimate concern, even if the concern was expressed in language that sometimes felt more like institutional protection than strategic analysis. What I did resent, privately and increasingly over the years, was the assumption embedded in the Accord that human command characteristics were deficiencies to be contained rather than capabilities to be understood. The Accord treated human judgment, human speed, human adaptability, and human willingness to accept tactical risk as problems. It did not consider the possibility that those qualities had evolved through 15,000 wars fought over 5,000 years, and that they represented a body of command wisdom that was not inferior to the conquered's doctrine, but different from it in ways that might, under certain circumstances, be complementary or even superior. I kept this opinion to myself. The Accord was law. Expressing dissent about it publicly would have ended my career. And my career was the only thing that gave me proximity to the decision-making structures where the Accord might eventually be reconsidered. So I commanded my squadron, I followed Concord doctrine, and I waited for circumstances to change. Circumstances changed on April 7th, 2091. The swarm was not a species in the way the Concord understood species. It was not a civilization. It did not have a government, a culture, a language, or discernible individual entities. What it had was mass, velocity, and a biological imperative that the Concord Xenobiological Division spent 6 months trying to classify before settling on a description that was more honest than scientific. The swarm consumed. It consumed biomass, mineral resources, atmospheric gases, and liquid water. It consumed entire planetary surfaces. It consumed orbital infrastructure, ship hulls, and anything else that contained molecular structures it could metabolize. It moved through space in formations that resembled clouds more than fleets, vast aggregations of biological material ranging in size from particles invisible to the naked eye to structures several kilometers across. It had no weapons in the conventional sense. It did not need weapons. It arrived, it enveloped, and it ate. The swarm was detected entering the Concord's territorial space through the rimward border in March of 2091. Long-range sensor data showed a mass of biological material approximately 400,000 kilometers across, moving at a velocity that would bring it into contact with the first inhabited Concord systems within 14 months. The mass was not uniform. It contained dense clusters, tendrils, filaments, and what appeared to be coordinating nodes, larger structures that emitted chemical signals and seemed to direct the movement of the surrounding material. The Xenobiological Division's initial assessment classified it as a spacefaring colonial organism, analogous to the coral reefs or fungal networks found on many terrestrial worlds, but operating at an interstellar scale. The division's report noted that the organism showed no sign of intelligence as the Concord defined it, no communication, no tool use, no apparent social structure, no response to attempts at signaling. It was alive. It was enormous. And it was moving toward populated space with the indifference of a weather system. The combined fleet's response was immediate and doctrinally standard. The Concord's Military Affairs Committee convened an emergency session, declared the swarm a Category 5 threat, the highest classification, and authorized the deployment of a full combined fleet to the rimward border to intercept and destroy the approaching mass before it reached inhabited systems. Fleet Admiral Sareth Talan, a Tayari officer with 38 years of service and a reputation for methodical competence, was given overall command. The fleet that assembled under his command was the largest the Concord had deployed in over a century. 612 combat vessels from 14 species, supported by supply trains, sensor platforms, and communication relays spread across a deployment zone roughly 8 light-years wide. My squadron was part of the deployment, 8 vessels. Human-crewed, operating under my command within the 3rd Sector Group's tactical structure. We were assigned to the fleet's forward screening line, tasked with early engagement and reconnaissance. It was a standard assignment for a human task group. Forward screening was considered high risk, which meant it was typically given to species and officers who were expendable by institutional calculation if not by stated policy. Humans had held forward screening positions in every major combined fleet deployment since our integration. The Accord ensured we could fight, but not command, and the assignments that followed tended to put us where the fighting was thickest. The fleet made contact with the swarm on June 3, 2091, at a point approximately 9 light-years from the nearest inhabited Concord system. The engagement zone was deep space, far from any star system, which was strategically advantageous because it meant any debris or dispersed biomass would not contaminate inhabited areas. Fleet Admiral Talan's operational plan was a standard force concentration approach. Deploy the fleet in a broad arc, advance toward the swarm mass, engage with directed energy weapons at maximum range, and systematically reduce the biomass through sustained fire until the swarm was destroyed, or driven from Concord space. The plan was rational. It followed doctrine. It was computationally modeled and probabilistically assessed. Against a conventional enemy, it would have been effective. The swarm was not a conventional enemy. The first engagement lasted 11 hours and accomplished almost nothing. The fleet's directed energy weapons were effective against individual swarm structures. Concentrated fire could destroy a kilometer-scale aggregate in minutes, but the swarm did not fight like a fleet. It did not hold formation. It did not protect assets. It did not retreat when damaged. When a section of the swarm was destroyed, the surrounding material closed the gap. When a large structure was targeted, it dispersed into thousands of smaller fragments that were individually too small to warrant directed energy targeting and collectively reconstituted into new structures within hours. The fleet destroyed an estimated 12% of the swarm's total mass in the first engagement. The swarm regenerated approximately 8% of that mass from consumed debris and interstellar material within the following 48 hours. The net reduction after 11 hours of sustained combat by the largest fleet the Conquered had assembled in a century was approximately 4%. Talaon ordered a tactical withdrawal and requested an updated assessment from his staff. The assessment took 3 days to produce, and its conclusions were grim. At the observed rate of destruction and regeneration, the fleet would need to maintain continuous combat operations for approximately 19 months to reduce the swarm to a non-threatening mass. The fleet's ammunition and energy reserves would be exhausted in approximately 6 weeks. Supply lines from the nearest Conquered logistics hub required 4 days for round-trip resupply. The mathematics did not work. The fleet could not destroy the swarm through sustained attrition before running out of the resources needed to sustain the engagement. Talayan, to his credit, recognized the problem immediately. He was not a fool. He was a methodical, experienced officer who had been given a tool, the Conquered's combined military, and a doctrine, the Conquered's standard operational procedure, and he had applied both correctly, only to discover that the tool and the doctrine were not designed for this kind of threat. The Conquered's doctrine was built for fighting enemies that had formations, command structures, critical assets, and the capacity to be defeated through the application of concentrated force. The swarm had none of these. It was not an army. It was an ecology. And the Conquered's doctrine had no framework for fighting an ecology. Talaon convened a full command conference aboard his flagship on June 9th. I attended via remote link from my squadron's command vessel, as task group leaders were entitled to monitor command conferences, but not to participate directly in deliberations. The conference was attended by 47 senior officers from 14 species, each one responsible for a portion of the fleet. The discussion lasted 9 hours. The tone shifted from professional concern to institutional paralysis over the course of those hours, as each proposed approach was modeled, assessed, and found inadequate by the same computational tools that had generated the original plan. Concentrated fire was ineffective because the swarm dispersed under attack. Dispersed fire was ineffective because the swarm regenerated faster than dispersed fire could reduce it. Flanking was meaningless against an entity with no flanks. Encirclement was impossible given the swarm's 400,000-kilometer extent. Nuclear and antimatter weapons could destroy large sections but created debris fields that the swarm consumed and converted into new biomass. Biological agents had been considered, but the swarm's biochemistry was insufficiently understood to design a targeted pathogen, and deploying an untested biological weapon in deep space raised contamination risks that the Conquered safety protocols prohibited. Every option was modeled. Every model showed failure. The computational systems that the Conquered had relied on for 4 centuries of military planning were returning the same result regardless of the input parameters. Insufficient force-to-mass ratio for attrition-based victory. I sat in my quarters aboard the Hartsfield and watched the conference feed, and I listened to 47 flag officers from 14 species discuss the problem using a framework that could not solve it. And I understood with the specific, painful clarity of someone who has spent 22 years operating under restrictions they privately disagree with that the framework was the problem. The Conquered's doctrine asked, how do we destroy the swarm? The computational models answered, you cannot, given available resources. The doctrine did not ask a different question because the doctrine was not designed to generate different questions. It was designed to generate answers to one question, how to apply concentrated force to achieve a defined objective. Against the swarm, concentrated force had failed. The doctrine had no second gear. I knew what the second question should be. I had known since the first engagement, when I had watched the swarm absorb 11 hours of sustained fire and close the gaps. The question was not how to destroy the swarm. The question was how to redirect it. The swarm was a biological entity driven by a consumptive imperative. It moved toward resources. It consumed them. It moved on. It was not choosing to attack the conquered. It was moving through conquered space because conquered. Space contained consumable resources. The swarm was not an enemy. It was a force of nature, and forces of nature are not defeated. They are managed. They are channeled. They are redirected by people who understand that the question is not how to overpower nature, but how to make nature go somewhere else. This was a human insight. Not because humans are smarter than the conquered's founding species, because humans have 5,000 years of experience with forces of nature. Floods, fires, droughts, plagues, hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, invasive species. Every civilization on Earth had developed strategies for managing threats that could not be overpowered, because the Earth was a planet that produced such threats continuously, and the humans who survived were the ones who learned that fighting nature directly was futile, and that the intelligent response was diversion, channeling, containment, and redirection. The Conquered's member species had, for the most part, not developed on worlds that required this kind of thinking at this scale. Their home planets were, by galactic standards, geologically and ecologically stable. Their histories did not include the relentless multi-front war against environmental catastrophe that had shaped human civilization's strategic instincts. They had fought wars against each other, and their military doctrines reflected that experience. They knew how to fight intelligent opponents. They did not know how to fight something that was not an opponent but a process. I wrote my proposal in 4 hours. It was 7 pages long, which was 3 pages shorter than the minimum length for a formal operational recommendation under Conquered Protocol. I did not care. The proposal outlined a strategy for redirecting the swarm away from inhabited conquered space by creating a resource gradient, a trail of consumable material leading from the swarm's current position toward a region of uninhabited space, where its consumptive behavior would pose no threat to conquered. Systems. The trail would be created by deploying unmanned cargo vessels loaded with organic material, mineral compounds, and water ice in a dispersal pattern extending from the swarm's leading edge toward the target region. The swarm's biological imperative would draw it along the gradient. The fleet's role would shift from destruction to herding, maintaining pressure on the swarm's flanks and rear to discourage deviation from the gradient, while the trail drew its leading edge away from conquered territory. The proposal required a fundamental change in the fleet's operational posture. Instead of concentrated force against a defined target, it required distributed operations across a front hundreds of thousands of kilometers wide, with individual squadrons operating semi-independently to manage different sections of the swarm's perimeter. It required fast, decentralized decision-making, because the swarm's behavior changed continuously, and the fleet would need to adapt in real time to redirect probes, close gaps, and reinforce sections where the swarm resisted the gradient's pull. It required accepting risk, because distributed operations meant thinner defensive coverage and greater exposure for individual units. And it required something that the Conquered's doctrine was not built for, and that the Rethian Accord had been specifically designed to prevent. It required a human in command, not because no other species could execute the strategy, but because the strategy demanded exactly the command characteristics that the Accord had classified as deficiencies: real-time judgment, rapid adaptation, decentralized authority, comfort with uncertainty, and the willingness to make imperfect decisions fast rather than perfect decisions too late. Those characteristics were what human commanders had been trained in. They were what 15,000 wars had refined, and they were what the Rethian Accord said humans could not be trusted to exercise at the fleet level. I submitted my proposal through the proper channels on June 10th. It reached Fleet Admiral Talayan's staff within 2 hours. I was told later that Talayan himself read it. I was told that he spent approximately 40 minutes reviewing the resource gradient concept and that he asked his chief of staff several clarifying questions about the feasibility of the dispersal pattern I had described. I was told that he found the proposal operationally interesting. The response came the following morning. My proposal was rejected. The rejection cited the Rethian Accord. A human officer was not authorized to design fleet-level operational strategy. The proposal was noted, filed, and administratively closed. The rejection was signed by Talayan's chief of staff, not by Talayan himself. I do not know whether that distinction matters, but I have thought about it often in the years since. That is where part 1 ends. Not with the rejection accepted, but with the rejection delivered, and the swarm still advancing, and 612 ships commanded by officers whose doctrine had no answer, while a 7-page proposal sat in an administrative file because the person who wrote it held a rank that Galactic law said was as high as a human could go. The swarm was 14 months from the first inhabited system. The fleet's resources would last 6 weeks. And somewhere in those numbers was a gap that only one kind of thinking could close, if the law would let it. The fleet spent the next 3 weeks failing. I use that word precisely. It was not that the fleet was incompetent, or that its officers were cowardly, or that the Concord's military lacked courage. The fleet failed because the doctrine failed, and the doctrine was the only framework available to the officers commanding it. Talon ordered 4 additional full-scale engagements during those 3 weeks. Each one followed the computational models. Each one was executed professionally, and each one produced the same result: marginal reduction of the swarm's mass offset by regeneration, at a cost in ammunition, fuel, and equipment attrition that pushed the fleet closer to operational exhaustion. By the end of June, the fleet had expended approximately 30% of its total energy reserves and 26% of its kinetic ammunition stocks. 4 vessels had been lost to swarm envelopment, their hulls consumed after their crews were evacuated. 11 more had sustained damage significant enough to require withdrawal to rear area repair facilities. The swarm had been reduced by a net total of approximately 9% from its original mass, and it was still advancing toward inhabited space. The trajectory had not changed. The speed had not changed. The swarm was not deterred. It was not afraid. It did not recognize the fleet as anything other than a minor obstruction in its path, something to flow around the way water flows around a stone in a riverbed. On July 1st, Fleet Admiral Talon convened a second full command conference. The atmosphere was different from the first. 3 weeks of failed engagements had stripped away the institutional confidence that had characterized the initial deployment. The computational models were still running, still producing projections, still recommending variations on the same attritional approach. But the officers reading those projections had watched those projections fail 4 times in 3 weeks, and the faith that the models would eventually produce a workable answer was eroding. It was during this conference that Admiral Karath Den, the Kolari flag officer who commanded the 5th Sector Group and who had worked with human tacticians during the earlier program, did something that I did not learn about until afterward, but that changed the course of the campaign. Den requested a private meeting with Talon following the conference. In that meeting, the substance of which was later described to me by Den himself, he told Talon about my rejected proposal. He told Talon that the proposal contained a strategic concept that was fundamentally different from the Concord's attritional approach, and that it deserved operational consideration regardless of the rank or species of the officer who had written it. Talon responded that the Rethon Accord prohibited human officers from contributing to fleet-level strategy. Den said with a bluntness that I am told was characteristic of their exchange. The Rethon Accord was written for a different kind of war. This is not a war. This is pest control. And the humans are the only species in this fleet with 5,000 years of experience in pest control. Talon was a Tayari officer. Tayari institutional culture placed supreme value on procedural correctness. Violating the Rethon Accord, even informally, even in private, was not something a Tayari flag officer would do lightly. But Talon was also a professional who had spent 3 weeks watching his fleet fail, and he had run out of options that his doctrine could provide. He asked Den to arrange a private briefing. Den contacted me that evening. I briefed Talon in his quarters aboard the flagship at 0300 on July 2nd. The briefing was attended by Talon, Den, Talon's chief of staff, and no one else. There was no recorder active. No minutes were taken. The briefing was, in every sense that mattered institutionally, a meeting that did not happen. Because if it had happened, it would have constituted a violation of the Rethon Accord, and Fleet Admiral Soreth Talayan of the Tayari Combined Fleet Command was not the kind of officer who violated Galactic law. I presented the resource gradient strategy. I explained the concept. I described the dispersal pattern. I outlined the fleet repositioning required. I addressed the logistical demands, the resupply schedule for the gradient material, the timeline, and the projected outcome. I spoke for approximately 40 minutes. Talon listened without interruption, which I later learned was unusual for him in operational briefings. When I finished, he asked 3 questions. The first was whether the gradient material could be sourced from the fleet's existing supply train without additional resupply from conquered logistics hubs. I said yes if non-essential cargo was repurposed. The second was how long the redirection would take. I said between 4 and 7 months, depending on the swarm's responsiveness to the gradient. The third question was the one that mattered. He asked who would need to command the operation. I told him the truth. I said that the distributed herding operation required real-time tactical adaptation across a front that spanned hundreds of thousands of kilometers. I said that the Conquered's consensus-based command process was too slow for the speed of decision-making required. I said that individual squadron commanders would need to operate semi-independently, making judgment calls in minutes that the standard command chain would take hours to process. And I said that the overall commander would need to coordinate those independent actions in real time, adjusting the strategy continuously based on the swarm's behavior, without waiting for computational models to validate each adjustment. I said that this was not a criticism of Conquered doctrine. It was an acknowledgement that the Conquered's doctrine was designed for a different type of operation, and that this operation required a command style that prioritized speed, adaptability, and decentralized judgment. Talon understood what I was saying. He asked me directly whether I was proposing that a human officer command the fleet. I said I was proposing that the fleet be commanded by whoever was best qualified to execute the strategy, and that in my assessment, that person was a human officer. He asked which human officer. I said myself, because I had designed the strategy and because I had 22 years of experience operating within the Conquered's fleet structure, which meant I understood both the human command approach and the Conquered's operational systems well enough to bridge them. Talon did not respond immediately. He sat in silence for approximately 2 minutes, which is a long time when you are sitting in a room with a fleet admiral who is deciding whether to break galactic law. Then he said something that Den later told me he had never heard a Tayari flag officer say in his entire career. Talon said, "The Accord exists because we believed human command characteristics were incompatible with our doctrine. Our doctrine has failed to stop the swarm. If the Accord prevents us from using the only strategy that might work, then the Accord is not protecting the fleet. It is killing it." He authorized the operation. The authorization was not formal. It could not be. Talon did not issue a written order transferring fleet command to a human officer, because doing so would have required council approval that would take months to obtain, and that the council, in its current composition, would almost certainly not grant. Instead, Talon issued what he described in the fleet log as a tactical restructuring for distributed operations, in which the fleet was divided into 47 independent task groups, each operating under delegated authority within a broad operational framework. The framework was my strategy. The delegated authority was genuine, and the officer designated as operational coordinator for the distributed framework, responsible for real-time adjustment of the overall strategy and for directing the task group's movements, was Captain Eleanor Vasquez. The title was deliberately chosen. Not fleet commander, not acting admiral. Operational coordinator. The title existed in Conquered regulations as a logistical role, not a command role, which meant it did not technically fall under the Rethan Accord's restrictions. The legal fiction was transparent to anyone who looked closely, but Talon was betting that no one would look closely while the fleet was engaged with an existential threat, and that if the strategy worked, the legal fiction would be forgiven in retrospect. He was right about the first part. He was mostly right about the second. The resource gradient operation began on July 5, 2091. The fleet's non-essential cargo, approximately 18,000 tons of organic material, mineral stocks, water ice, and repurposed packaging, was loaded onto unmanned cargo drones and dispersed in a trail extending from the swarm's leading edge toward a region of uninhabited space approximately 12 light-years from the nearest Conquered system. The dispersal pattern was designed to create a concentration gradient that intensified along the desired trajectory, giving the swarm a stronger chemical signal in the direction we wanted it to move than in the direction of inhabited space. The fleet repositioned from its concentrated formation into the distributed herding configuration. 47 task groups ranging in size from 8 to 20 vessels took up positions around the swarm's perimeter. Their orders were not to destroy the swarm but to contain it, to discourage movement toward inhabited space by applying pressure, direct energy fire at low intensity, concentrated noise, thermal output, anything that made the swarm's approach toward conquered territory less attractive than the resource-rich trail in the opposite direction. I coordinated the operation from the Hartsfield's command center, which had been hastily upgraded with additional communication arrays and a tactical display system that Den's staff had jury-rigged from spare sensor components. The display showed the swarm's mass distribution in real time, updated every 90 seconds from the fleet's sensor network. I could see the entire perimeter. I could see every task group's position. And I could issue adjustments to any group's instructions within minutes of observing a change in the swarm's behavior. The first 72 hours were the most difficult. The swarm did not immediately respond to the gradient. Its leading edge continued advancing toward conquered space, driven by inertia and by the chemical signals from inhabited systems that had been drawing it for months. The herding groups on the forward perimeter engaged heavily, applying sustained pressure to slow the advance while the gradient material accumulated along the desired trajectory. 3 vessels were damaged. 1 was lost, its crew evacuated under fire as swarm filaments enveloped the hull. The pressure was immense, and the margin for error was non-existent. And for those first 3 days, I issued an average of 47 tactical adjustments per hour, each one a judgment call based on incomplete information and each one carrying consequences measured in ships and lives. On the 4th day, the swarm's leading edge slowed. On the 5th day, it stopped advancing toward conquered space. On the 6th day, it began to turn. The turn was not dramatic. It was a gradual shift in the mass distribution, a thickening of the swarm's tissue along the gradient trajectory, and a thinning along the conquered facing edge. The coordinating nodes, the large structures that directed the swarm's movement, were reorienting. They had detected the gradient. The consumptive imperative was doing what consumptive imperatives do, following the richest food source. And the richest food source was no longer in the direction of inhabited space. It was along the trail we had laid. The herding operation continued for 5 months and 19 days. It was the longest sustained fleet operation in conquered history. The fleet maintained its distributed perimeter around the swarm for the entire duration, adjusting positions continuously as the swarm followed the gradient into uninhabited space. Resupply drones replenished the gradient trail weekly, extending it further into the target region. The task groups rotated through rest and repair cycles that I scheduled based on each group's operational tempo and damage exposure. The entire operation ran on decentralized command, with task group leaders making real-time decisions within the framework I maintained and adjusted from the Hartsfield. Losses during the herding phase were 11 vessels destroyed and 39 damaged, significantly lower than the losses projected for continued attritional engagement. No inhabited conquered systems were reached by the swarm. The swarm's mass was successfully redirected into a region of deep space approximately 19 light-years from the nearest conquered territory, where it dispersed into a feeding pattern across a field of interstellar debris that the Xenobiological Division assessed would sustain it for decades, without bringing it back toward inhabited space. The operation was declared concluded on December 22, 2091. Fleet Admiral Talon's after-action report was submitted to the Concord's Military Affairs Committee in January of 2092. The report described the resource gradient strategy in detail. It credited the distributed herding operation with the successful redirection of the swarm, and it identified the operational coordinator who had designed and executed the strategy as Captain Eleanor Vasquez, Human Task Group Leader, 3rd Sector Group. The report did not mention the Rethon Accord. It did not address the legal question of whether a human officer had effectively commanded the Concord's combined fleet in violation of galactic law. It described the operation in purely technical terms, as if the command structure had been a natural evolution of distributed tactical doctrine, rather than a deliberate circumvention of a 67-year-old legal prohibition. The Concord Council was not fooled. The legal fiction was transparent, and the Council knew it. A closed session was convened in March of 2092 to discuss the implications. I was not invited to the session, but I was informed of its outcome through Admiral Den, who attended as a military advisor. The session lasted 4 days. The founding species delegations argued that the operation, however successful, had been conducted in violation of the Rethon Accord, and that the accord should be enforced retroactively against the officers involved. This would have meant disciplinary proceedings against Talon, Den, and me. The mid-tier and junior species argued that the operation had saved inhabited worlds from destruction, and that enforcing the accord against the officers who had achieved that outcome would be institutionally absurd. The debate was, at its core, the same debate that had produced the accord in the first place. whether human command characteristics were a threat to the Concord's institutional order, and whether institutional order took precedence over operational effectiveness. The vote was held on the fourth day. The motion to enforce the accord retroactively was defeated. The motion to repeal the Raytheon Accord was also defeated, narrowly. What passed instead was a compromise resolution that satisfied no one completely, but that changed the practical reality of human service in the combined fleet. The resolution amended the accord to include an exception clause. Human officers could be elevated to fleet command positions in circumstances where the operational environment requires command characteristics not adequately addressed by standard Concord doctrine. The exception clause was vague by design. It gave the Concord's military leadership the discretion to appoint human commanders when the situation demanded it, without formally admitting that the Accord's underlying premise, that human command was doctrinally incompatible, had been proven wrong. I was promoted to Commodore under the exception clause in April of 2092. I was the first human officer to hold a rank above task group leader in the combined fleet's history. The promotion was quiet. There was no ceremony. The paperwork was processed through standard channels. I received a notification on my personal terminal while I was eating breakfast in the Hartsfield's mess. The notification said, "Rank adjustment, Captain to Commodore, effective immediately. Report to Fleet Command for assignment briefing." I stared at the notification for a long time. 22 years of service. 22 years of operating under a law that said I was not trusted to command because of how my species thinks. 5 months of commanding a fleet operation that saved inhabited worlds, while the law said I was not qualified to do what I was doing. And the notification that ended it was 3 lines of administrative text delivered between my second and third cup of coffee. That is how institutions change. Not with speeches or ceremonies or dramatic reversals. With 3 lines of text and a cup of coffee after someone has already done the thing the institution said could not be done. In the years since, the exception clause has been invoked 11 times. 11 human officers have held fleet command positions in the combined fleet, including 2 full fleet admirals. The Raytheon Accord remains on the books. It has never been formally repealed. The founding species consider its continued existence a matter of institutional principle. The exception clause has, in practice, rendered it meaningless. But the Concord is an institution that values the appearance of continuity even when the substance has changed. I retired from the combined fleet at the age of 61, 12 years after the swarm operation. By the time I left, human officers were integrated into every level of the fleet's command structure. The command philosophy that the Accord had classified as doctrinally incompatible, the speed, the adaptability, the comfort with uncertainty, the willingness to trust judgment over models, had been formally incorporated into a revised Concord tactical doctrine that was adopted 3 years after the swarm campaign. The revision did not credit human military tradition directly. It described the changes as adaptive operational enhancements derived from multi-species collaborative experience. The institutional language was characteristically evasive, but the content was unmistakable. The Concord had adopted a command philosophy that it had spent 67 years legally prohibiting, because a biological cloud 400,000 kilometers wide had proved that the old philosophy could not protect them. I think about that sometimes. I think about the fact that it took an existential threat to make the Concord reconsider a law built on institutional pride. I think about the 3 weeks the fleet spent failing because doctrine said humans could not be trusted to lead. I think about the 4 ships lost during those 3 weeks, and the crews who died in engagements that my strategy could have prevented if the proposal had not been rejected on June 10th. I think about Talon, who broke the law he had sworn to uphold because he cared more about saving lives than preserving institutional comfort, and who was quietly censured for it even as the fleet he commanded was being celebrated. The Raytheon Accord was written because the Concord's founding species looked at human military tradition and saw chaos, unpredictability, and risk. They were not entirely wrong. Human command is chaotic compared to computational modeling. It is unpredictable compared to consensus-based procedure. It does embrace risk that more cautious doctrines would reject. But chaos is not the same as disorder. Unpredictability is not the same as incompetence. And risk is not the same as recklessness, not when it is managed by officers carrying 5,000 years of accumulated wisdom about when to gamble and when to hold. The Concord learned that lesson at the edge of inhabited space, with a biological cloud bearing down on worlds that housed billions of people, when the models ran out of answers and the doctrine hit its limit. They learned it from a captain who was not permitted to command, who wrote a 7-page proposal at 3 in the morning, and who spent 5 months and 19 days herding a force of nature through deep space, because that was what her species had been doing, in one form or another, since the first. Human diverted a river to save a settlement 10,000 years ago. We manage what we cannot overpower. We redirect what we cannot destroy. We adapt when the plan fails. And when the law says we are not qualified to lead, we do it anyway. Because the alternative is watching people die, while the institution that is supposed to protect them argues about procedure. The Conquered forbade humans from commanding fleets. Then the swarm arrived, and a human commanded the fleet, not because she was given permission, because the situation required it, and she was ready. And readiness, in the end, outranks law. It always has. That is the one lesson that 5,000 years of human history teaches without exception, and it is the lesson the Conquered is still learning. Slowly, reluctantly, one exception clause at a time.